On November 6, 1817, died the Princess Charlotte, only child of the Prince Regent and heir to the Crown of England. Her short life had hardly been a happy one. By nature impulsive, capricious, and vehement, she had always longed for liberty, and she had never possessed it. She had been brought up among violent family quarrels, had been early separated from her disreputable and eccentric mother, and handed over to the care of her disreputable and selfish father. When she was 17, he decided to marry her off to the Prince of Orange. She at first acquiesced, but suddenly falling in love with Prince Augustus of Prussia, she determined to break off the engagement. This was not her first love affair, for she had previously carried on a clandestine correspondence with a Captain Hesse. Prince Augustus was already married, morganatically, but she did not know it, and he did not tell her. While she was spinning out the negotiations with the Prince of Orange, the Allied sovereign, it was June 1814, arrived in London to celebrate their victory. Among them, in the suite of the Emperor of Russia, was the young and handsome Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. He made several attempts to attract the notice of the princess, but she, with her heart elsewhere, paid very little attention. Next month, the Prince Regent, discovering that his daughter was having secret meetings with Prince Augustus, suddenly appeared upon the scene, and, after dismissing her household, sentenced her to a strict seclusion in Windsor Park. "God Almighty grant me patience!" she exclaimed, falling on her knees in an agony of agitation. Then she jumped up, ran down the back stairs and out into the street, hailed a passing cab, and drove to her mother's house in Bayswater. She was discovered, pursued, and at length, yielding to the persuasions of her uncles, the Dukes of York and Sussex, of Brougham, and of the Bishop of Salisbury, she returned to Carlton House at 2 o'clock in the morning. She was immured at Windsor, but no more was heard of the Prince of Orange. Prince Augustus, too, disappeared. The way was at last open to Prince Leopold of Saxe-Coburg. This prince was clever enough to get round the regent, to impress the ministers, and to make friends with another of the princess's uncles, the Duke of Kent. Through the Duke he was able to communicate privately with the princess, who now declared that he was necessary to her happiness. When, after Waterloo, he was in Paris, the Duke's aide-de-camp carried letters backwards and forwards across the Channel. In January 1816 he was invited to England, and in May the marriage took place. The character of Prince Leopold contrasted strangely with that of his wife. The younger son of a German princeling, he was at this time 26 years of age. He had served with distinction in the war against Napoleon. He had shown considerable diplomatic skill at the Congress of Vienna, and he was now to try his hand at the task of taming a tumultuous princess. Cold and formal in manner, collected in speech, careful in action, he soon dominated the wild, impetuous, generous creature by his side. There was much in her, he found, of which he could not approve. She quizzed, she stamped, she roared with laughter. She had very little of that self-command which is especially required of princes. Her manners were abominable. Of the latter he was a good judge, having moved, as he himself explained to his niece many years later, in the best society of Europe, being in fact what is called in French de la fleur des pois. There was continual friction, but every scene ended in the same way. Standing before him like a rebellious boy in petticoats, her body pushed forward, her hands behind her back, with flaming cheeks and sparkling eyes, she would declare at last that she was ready to do whatever he wanted. "If you wish it, I will do it," she would say. "I want nothing for myself." He invariably answered, "When I press something on you, it is from a conviction that it is for your interest and for your good." Among the members of the household at Claremont, near Escher, where the royal pair were established, was a young German physician, Christian Friedrich Stockmar. He was the son of a minor magistrate in Coburg, and after taking part as a medical officer in the war, he had settled down as a doctor in his native town. Here he had met Prince Leopold, who had been struck by his ability, and on his marriage brought him to England as his personal physician. A curious fate awaited this young man. Many were the gifts which the future held in store for him, many and various: influence, power, mystery, unhappiness, a broken heart. At Claremont his position was a very humble one, but the princess took a fancy to him, called him Stocky, and romped with him along the corridors. Dyspeptic by constitution, melancholic by temperament, he could yet be lively on occasion, and was known as a wit in Coburg. He was virtuous, too, and served the royal menage with approbation. "My master," he wrote in his diary, "is the best of all husbands in all the 5 quarters of the globe, and his wife bears him an amount of love, the greatness of which can only be compared with the English national debt." Before long he gave proof of another quality, a quality which was to color the whole of his life-cautious sagacity. When in the spring of 1817 it was known that the princess was expecting a child, the post of one of her physicians in ordinary was offered to him, and he had the good sense to refuse it. He perceived that his colleagues would be jealous of him, that his advice would probably not be taken, but that if anything were to go wrong, it would be certainly the foreign doctor who would be blamed. Very soon, indeed, he came to the opinion that the low diet and constant bleedings to which the unfortunate princess was subjected were an error. He drew the prince aside and begged him to communicate this opinion to the English doctors, but it was useless. The fashionable lowering treatment was continued for months. On November 5th, at 9 o'clock in the evening, after a labor of over 50 hours, the princess was delivered of a dead boy. At midnight her exhausted strength gave way. When at last Stockmar consented to see her, he went in and found her obviously dying, while the doctors were plying her with wine. She seized his hand and pressed it. "They have made me tipsy," she said. After a little he left her, and was already in the next room when he heard her call out in her loud voice, "Stocky! Stocky!" As he ran back, the death rattle was in her throat. She tossed herself violently from side to side, then suddenly drew up her legs, and it was over. The prince, after hours of watching, had left the room for a few moments' rest, and Stockmar had now to tell him that his wife was dead. At first he could not be made to realize what had happened. On their way to her room he sank down on a chair, while Stockmar knelt beside him. It was all a dream. It was impossible. At last, by the bed, he too knelt down and kissed the cold hands. Then, rising and exclaiming, "Now I am quite desolate. Promise me never to leave me," he threw himself into Stockmar's arms. 2. The tragedy at Claremont was of a most upsetting kind. The royal kaleidoscope had suddenly shifted, and nobody could tell how the new pattern would arrange itself. The succession to the throne, which had seemed so satisfactorily settled, now became a matter of urgent doubt. George III was still living, an aged lunatic at Windsor, completely impervious to the impressions of the outer world. Of his 7 sons, the youngest was of more than middle age, and none had legitimate offspring. The outlook, therefore, was ambiguous. It seemed highly improbable that the Prince Regent, who had lately been obliged to abandon his stays and presented a preposterous figure of debauched obesity, could ever again, even on the supposition that he divorced his wife and remarried, become the father of a family. Besides